Inflation's at record highs. The big three don't want to give a thing. They don't want to compromise. This contract negotiation ain't going the way we planned. The union's fighting for what we need. It's time we make a stand. It's time we fight for what is right. We've been pushed around and knocked down. Bad enough, it's over this time. We're gonna hold out till the end for a record contract, record win.
Welcome everybody to this week's Griscom stream. That's a jam out there by UAW local member UAW member of local 1853, Shane Cothran, that was posted up on the UAW's Twitter account. Still riding high on the strike and the stand-up strike and all of these incredible videos and things that we've been seeing so far as has this historic moment, and it not just labor history, but frankly American history is ongoing. This is one of the most important things that has happened in a long while, and us here at Left Reckoning are certainly here for it, as I know all of y'all are. As always, if you are in the areas where some of these strikes are ongoing, see if there's ways that you can help out. There's always need for people to show up at the picket lines. And this is also a time when it's very easy to be effective by being online. Usually we tell people, you got to go outside and do all this kind of stuff, and that's super important. But this is a moment right now where being a little Twitter warrior really does make a difference. Continue pushing back against the big three companies' propaganda and attacks on the union. Continue pushing people to support this strike and understand why it is not only important just for these members, but it's important for everybody in the working class to see a positive result here. This is where you can really make a difference, because there's a lot of attempts right now to start to muddy the water. But luckily, the American people are very much behind the UAW. I'm sure people might have seen some of these early pollings that have been coming out. But we're seeing numbers like 75% of Americans support the UAW over the big three auto companies. I saw another one was a little bit lower, 71%. And it just shows something that's fundamental to material reality and to American politics, is that working class politics is a winning issue. And man, if only we could see a major party standing up and really fighting for these things, running on these things, and most important, delivering on these things. We'd be living in a far different world than the one we are now. But as we say on this program, and as Sean Fain has said, you know what? The time of sitting around and waiting for somebody up high to come and deliver victory for people is over. In fact, it's so much more important, in my opinion, for working class people to win these kind of victories themselves. There are people who are on our side, and they're friends of mine. People who I've worked with in the past, people who I support, but have a very different view about how to enact change. And it's been one of these kind of debates that you see on the left particularly every time there's a presidential election, right? Which is like all this workup about what are we going to do in the presidential election? Who are we going to vote for? What are we going to do? Oh, maybe we can get some concessions or do some radical strategy or something like that. And as people who've been watching me since I started doing this with Michael Brooks, no, I've never been very mystified by that kind of thing. I supported Bernie Sanders because that was one of the most apparent openings for our kind of politics. But these kind of machinations that people sort of support, it's like, oh, we'll support centrist Democrats or these kind of figures. And maybe we can, push this party in one way or another. And I'm not even trying to knock that strategy or get into all of that. But what I'm trying to say is that fundamentally, if you believe in working class politics, right, not just as a moral category in the sense of like, oh, I want these people to be, supported and to be looked after, but actually believe in the radical belief that within every single member of the working class, there are leaders, there are people who have the ability to govern themselves, govern their own lives, and govern their communities, then you want to see a strong working class. And you know how you get a strong working class is by going into conflict with the bosses, going into conflict with the capitalist class, going into conflict with the big three auto companies. And there are people who want to try to take political credit for what's going on right now in the UAW, or also what's going on right now in the labor movement in general in this country. As the labor movement is not 100% where it needs to be, but Lord help us all, it has developed tremendously in the past few years, becoming more militant, more democratic, and more willing to stand up and fight and say that the old way of doing things is over. It's time for a more rooted and militant labor movement in this country. You want to see that fight being led by the working class. You want to see those victories being won by the working class. And it's incredibly harmful to the movement to sit around and say, oh, this, labor policy from the NLRB is responsible for these kinds of things. No, there are terrains that are better, right? There are things that we advocate for and want to see the government do, but a strong working class movement is always going to have to be able to win on its own 2 feet. Um, and that's the thing that we 100% need to be supporting and advocating for is whatever the conditions are. If they're good conditions, take and fight for more. If they're bad conditions, take and fight for more. The strategy is the same because at the end of the day, there is one final conflict, and that conflict is going to be between working class people and the people who profit off of the immiseration of the many. And this gets muddied up a lot, particularly in people who talk politics for a living. It gets muddied up a lot, and it's a distinction that unfortunately a lot of people don't make. And again, I'm not trying to sow disunity or start fights or anything like that. I'm advocating for a position, and that position is that the working class needs to not just be centered or heard or all those kind of things. No, they need to be leading. They need to be leading, and the role of people as members of the working class is to push that movement forward. And then for fights that aren't your direct fight, to be bolstering, fighting for them, and supporting them because we all win when working people are stronger. Now, as people know, these streams are a little bit more casual. So if you have any questions or things that you would like to get in there, I know we just got some new friends over here on the Twitch chat. Feel free to jump in there with any questions in the chat. I'm always happy to talk about whatever. But we have some bits here from the chat already that I'll get into. We have some more clips from the UAW strike that we want to be talking about. Um, and yeah, we'll be going. Somebody from Canada asked me a question about a labor struggle in Canada. I have to apologize. I do not know the answer to that. Um, I think I saw something from Caleb. I did not see the question. Um, Caleb asked me the question, how do y'all think the best, what do y'all think is best for mutual aid groups to engage in political education for the working class community? And how should they show support for unions, revolutionary workers movements? Well, I mean, you show support by showing up, right? I mean, this is one of these moments right now is when it's as easy as ever. Communicate with people. Don't just show up. You're more than welcome to show up at a picket line. I'm not saying in the sense that you're not welcome, but this is a great opportunity to build connections and relationships with people. So reach out to locals. If you are in an area that is going to be having a picket, that people are going on strike, reach out to members of the local. So one, you can be utilized in the most effective way. You know what shifts people or more bodies are needed, and then also you're building relationships with people in labor, right? That's the best kind of immediate strategy. There's a lot of work, that you can do regarding mutual aid with these kind of things, which is great. But frankly, I think that organizing around class and political issues is first and foremost. I think mutual aid is something that can have a role, but really, what we need to be focusing on is building class politics and fighting in the labor movement directly. Can Looney Tunes ask, can you give your reaction to Rupert Murdoch's decision to step down from from News Corp and Fox this morning? I mean, look, he's an old guy, so he's done. I mean, he has been a plague on society in general across the globe. And it's a great, as Jeremy Corbyn said earlier today, this is a great argument for those media companies to be broken up. There's no reason for one person or one small group of people to control as much of our media as they do right now. Bob VP says, "Is this a chance to foster slash expand class consciousness, or should we just ride this wave and get better organized with what we have?" No, this is the time to be expanding class consciousness. This is the time to be doing political education. One, because there is direct need for it, and two, because these are moments. Going on strike, any kind of conflict with the bosses. Um, Lines people up on a side, right? You are on one side or you are in the other, or you're sitting on the fence, right? Which is, in fact, taking a side. Those moments are clarifying. It's like jumping into a cold river, right? It is invigorating, it's shocking, and you get a moment of clarity. So this is exactly when the kind of terrain and the way that people are lining up should be made extremely clear. And that goes from people who are directly opposing the strike to people who are trying to hedge their bets, right? Politicians who are sort of saying things like, "Oh, I hope this strike is quick," right? And I hope that everybody can come together and see eye to eye. It's like, no, we want the working class to win. We want the UAW to win. That is the position. Anything else is literally just groveling in front at the feet of some of the most powerful people in the world, right? No, so this is a moment to be directly engaged, not to just ride a wave. To be participating and pushing this movement as far forward as possible. And we're seeing that, and that's one of the reasons that I very much support the media strategy that we've seen so far from the UAW, the media appearances of people like Sean Fain, because they've been very clear that this is not just an isolated fight, but this is a fight for the working class and as a whole. And in a second, we're going to talk about some of the international dimensions that I think are really important going on. Yes, and solidarity to the WGA and the AMPTP as they're doing their fight as well. I think Sean Fain's ambitions right now are to win for the UAW. We got a fundamental question here. Zach Chap asked, "Can you differentiate between the difference between personal and private property?" So, I mean, this is something that I think a lot of people get sort of confused about, right? When we're talking about when socialists talk about private property is socially useful property, right? That has been enclosed upon, right? And most clearly, what we're talking about here is the property that is utilized in production, right? So things like the apparatus, like industrial apparatus, like factories, workplaces, and land, right? Land in the sense of, I mean, a story, if you're unfamiliar with my work, I wrote a long piece for Jacobin in the fall about the fence cutting wars in Texas, where I'm from. And the fence cutting wars was a radical fight. Um, was a radical fight to fight back against the enclosure of public lands by the cattle barons and the major landlords in Texas and all across the state. Cowboys got together and they started cutting down barbed wire fences that were the tool that was being used to enclose upon this kind of public land, or even if it was technically private land that was believed by the vast majority of the people to belong to the people. Personal property is like your toothbrush or your phone or your wallet, right? These are things that you're not utilizing to exploit other people, right? That other people aren't laboring on. So people always think that when socialists talk about private property, they're like, "Oh, they're going to come for your television." No one gives a shit about that. That has no value to society at large, right? That's personal property, which is something that's very different from private property. Private property is a social relation, right? These are things that exist in the public space, right? In, tools that are utilized to produce commodities and products to be used, right? That's very different from the things that you hold as an individual. And there's no social need or to come after that kind of thing, right? There's no interest in coming after the thing. When we talk about private property, we're talking about those things, right? The factory, the workplace, um, the large tracts of land, and things of that nature, not your car, or your television or your stove, right? Because again, those aren't things that are being utilized in capitalist production. Those are things that are being used primarily for their use value, and that's another important distinction that a lot of people miss. So there's a difference in a commodity. In general, there's use value and exchange value, right? And what does that mean? Exchange value is what something is worth on the market, right? Literally, its use is to be turned into money, right? Um, and then there's use value, and these forces are oftentimes in contradiction. Look at housing, right? What's the use value of housing? Well, it's to house somebody, give somebody cover from the elements for them to live, for them to raise their family, to exist. And then there's the exchange value. And those two things are in conflict constantly in this country. That's why we have a housing crisis in this country, because we utilize housing under this system, not so much for the use value, right? Or at least the system prioritizes the exchange value over the use value of these things, right? That's why you have the absurdity of homes being left empty, or in cities like New York, entire apartment units being left empty because the way that our society functions, it privileges the exchange value of these things, right? The ability to seek rents on these things or sell these things over their actual use value for society. All right, I'm gonna make sure I'm not missing too much before we got some good clips to get to in just a second. Brendan says, Brendan, I don't know if you came in after I was talking about that. They were asking me to respond to something I said last week about a kind of conservative argument that we get from people, which is, that basically government policy is what is creating this labor movement right now, and I find that to be a conservative argument, right? Um, what do I mean by conservative? I mean conservative in the sense of it's not the radical argument, right? It's more of the kind of status quo argument, right? The radical argument is that we need to be building working class power, and supporting the working class movement, not just for like the short term goal of like some higher wages or concessions, but rather because we believe fundamentally that working class people should be in control of their lives. If you boil it down to its most basic level, right? The socialist argument for society is that working class people should have democratic say in their lives, and that includes politics, and that includes at their workplace. So you get this from a lot of progressive commentators, right, who make a lot of arguments about who you should support in this or that case. Say, well, this person's bad, but they might pursue labor policies that we think are better than others. And look, I'm not saying that, I'm not even jumping into that argument, right, about whether or not that's the right or wrong strategy. What I'm saying is that's a conservative orientation to the question of labor organizing. Why is it conservative? It's conservative because it puts the engine of the labor movement in government instead of in the hands of the people in the labor movement. And if you look throughout American history, right, you look at things like the UAW, you look at movements like the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, or even if you don't want to just focus on America, you look at every labor movement the world over. They have been able to organize under conditions all across the board. I mean, we talked about like the Battle of Blair Mountain on this show, right? We've talked about times when the government was oftentimes aligned, not just in the sense of like behind the back doors making deals and things like that, but literally armed agents of the state harassing, killing, and sabotaging labor movements, right? Labor has always had to stand up in those conditions, just as it has to stand up in conditions like today, right? Where it's still extremely harmful. Um, but the FBI is maybe playing, and the Pinkertons, right, to use an old school example, are maybe playing less of a direct role in trying to break labor movements, right? So when I'm talking about that being a conservative argument, it's conservative because instead of envisioning, the way out of this crisis, the way to build a stronger labor movement into the hands of the people, right, which is a radical proposition for a lot of people. because instead of being able to look at the political situation, say like, oh well, if only we get this many members in this many positions, in this many places, then we'll have a strong labor movement. It says the tools of the working class are already here. It's not saying that it's easy to do those things, but it's saying that the only way that things are ever going to change is if working class people are organized, are prepared to withhold their labor to shut the system down, to get the things that they demand. And out of those demands comes power, right? There was a great video that the UAW put out recently about that very question of power, right? Where they're looking at the membership and they're saying, what I see right here is power. This is the power of the people. That's people's power when labor movements get together and get organized. There are conditions that are better than others. I'm not denying that. But if you're going to sit here and say that the reason that we have seen mobilizations at places like Starbucks, mobilizations like some of the increases in union membership that we've seen over the past couple of years, mobilizations like what we saw at the Teamsters, mobilizations like what we're seeing right now at the UAW. And instead of saying, hey, these are movements that are coming from people getting together, either democratizing their union or willing to take the risk to stand up against some of the most powerful people in the world and build a union and fight for it, right? If you don't see that as the primary engine of what we're seeing right now, and are instead saying, oh, the NLRB is doing this or Joe Biden is doing this, in my opinion, that is a conservative argument because it takes all of the power away from the people and it puts all of the power in the hands of elected officials and politicians. And that's not my politics or my view on the world. So that's what I mean by saying that that's a conservative argument. Thank you very much, Froggy, for the. Yeah, I guess y'all can't see it on the YouTube chat, but I do love those over there on the Twitch. They got me and Stetson over there. And like last thing I'll say about that is this, right? Is that I'm working on this piece for Jacobin on the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which was a radical union in the South that organized tenant farmers, right? The people at the very bottom of the society. And if you're not familiar with what the tenant farming system was, it was basically a recreation of slavery where people were indebted and controlled by the old plantation owners who still owned a lot of land in the South after the Civil War. And you saw this under FDR, right? So the Great Depression hits, and the FDR administration puts forward this plan to deal with the crisis of production in the agricultural industry called the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And what that policy was that they basically were telling farmers and large landholders who produce agricultural products to tear up one third of their production. And the idea was using supply and demand to raise the price of agricultural products in the United States, so more money could be flowing into the hands of the agricultural industry. Well, a big problem with that was the fact that the way that they were paying those farmers and large landholders to do that was direct payments from the federal government, right? And that worked nice or well, as far as I know, for maybe small time farmers in the Midwest, and it certainly worked very well for large landholders in the South. But what did that mean for tenant farmers? Nearly a million tenant farmers were evicted and were left jobless in the Great Depression South as a result of that policy. And even though that the FDR administration had said, "Oh, you got to give some money to the workers," well, they gave all the money to the plantation owners, and surprising, the plantation owners were not distributing that money to the people. So, what did the Southern tenant farmers have to do? They had to fight the capitalist class, and they organized a union to get better wages and better conditions for themselves in the cotton fields. And they also had to fight the FDR administration, particularly Henry Wallace, who was the Secretary of Agriculture at the time, who didn't want to deal with these poor Southerners, black and white, who were asking for their money, right? Why would I want to deal with that, right? I've made most of the agricultural industry happy, particularly the major figures in it. Why do I want to deal with these workers? Well, would you make the argument then that like, oh, well, the FDR administration at least was putting provisions in there for workers and all that? No, We all know what the answer is, and it is what the Southern Tenant Farmers Union did, which is that they took on the state, they took on the FDR administration, they played, they utilized the media as well as they could by publishing stories about what their conditions were like, threatening the FDR administration with making public some of the statements that were coming from the Department of Agriculture at that time. At one point, one of the members, one of Henry Wallace's guys in the Department of Agriculture, said when somebody asked him, "Hey, why is every other interest of the agricultural industry here except for the workers, right? Except for the Southern Tenant Farmer workers, sorry, Southern Tenant Farmer Union." And the response from Henry Wallace's boy was, "Well, would you have us put chickens on the poultry board?" Right? Metaphor is pretty clear there what they thought about workers. So the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, upon hearing this, made tremendous threats to progressives within the FDR administration, like, "Hey, we're going to go public with all of this kind of stuff." And they had to pressure and they had to fight the state, right? And that's FDR, right? Who, yes, it absolutely is true that FDR was much more friendly to labor than any president that had come before him, at least in that generation, right? But the idea that all these things came from FDR instead of coming from the working class is wrong. FDR was responding to tremendous increases in the amount of unionized labor, tremendous shows of strength and massive strikes, like organizations like the UAW. And that's why labor got a seat at the table. It wasn't because the government just acquiesced. And that's going to be the same thing today in 2023 as it was during the Great Depression. So that's why I call that a conservative argument, right? Because it puts all of the history making, the change making into the halls of power, the political debates that are happening between politicians and the bureaucracy. And it leaves very little room for the power of labor. And thank you, Brendan, for the question. Obviously, I'm very happy to talk about that. So, this is another good question from Charles's Ghost, who says, "Is it generally a goal for labor to eventually bring about legislative change through labor action?" Yes, I mean that is that is a part of the goal, right? Um, But if you forget how you get there, that's when those things become weakened, right? And think about how much of the fight in the American labor movement is getting the institutions that were set up generations ago to operate in the same way that they were initially set up to do, right? That's a huge part of the labor fight today, right? And so the point here, and why again I find this to be, the over fixation on the legislative side, right, on the government side versus on the labor side, to be a conservative position is exactly that, right? Because you can get reforms and you should fight for reforms. I'm not one of these people who says don't fight for reforms, don't engage in politics. It's like the mo of this program. Um, but rather understand that the only way that we get things is by fighting and being organized and expressing our power. Yes, at the ballot box, but most importantly on the labor floor, right? And seeing how those victories of previous labor movements can be rolled back when when that power and that organization wanes is exactly the reason why I say today that it's incredibly important for people not to forget where change starts and where it can be maintained and where it can be expanded. And that doesn't come from politicians, that comes from the working class, right? This is fundamental. The fundamental socialist position here is that power and change, positive at least, comes from the working class because the capitalist class is entrenched and they're patient, right? And if the board shifts, right, and they see themselves on the back foot, they will have to accept concessions. But they also know that, hey, we have a 10, 15, 20-year long game strategy here. And yeah, we might have to give up some of these things today, but we can roll those things back in 10, 15 years and go back to the same level of exploitation that we want, right? So again, it's not the argument that there's nothing that can be done on the governmental level or that we should not pay attention to the governmental level and we shouldn't advocate for things. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that this power and the ability to make those things effective and actually work for working people instead of being sloganeering on campaigns is from having an active and militant working class movement, and thinking that you can that anything is settled in these fights as long as capitalists and the rich hold tremendous power over our politics. You'd be wrong. I mean, the entire history of social democracy shows exactly that, right? You can win tremendous things for working people, but man, it only takes a couple crises and some weakening in the organization of the labor movement for a lot of that stuff to be rolled back, right? And that is the kind of fundamental point and the thing that I'm trying to counsel people against. Thanks, Josh, for the super chat. Power, what it is, and how to wield it. David Griscom. That'd be fun. Aspirational. And put very simply and correctly by Candified, you need power behind an organized movement outside of electoral politics in order to apply pressure on an electoral system. And you also need, on that, just saying, you also need organizations that um, this is one of the fundamental things about working class organization is that the union is the organized collective power of the working class in the particular industry that they're organized. You need to have a national political organization for the interests of working class as well, right? And those things need to be connected. um, and we have low amounts of labor organization in this country. Hopefully we're working to expand that, right? um, but we certainly don't have national political organizations of labor right now. And that's something that's desperately needed to be able to push these things through. um, Carl the Wall says, "Do you ever see agents within union structures acting to try and sabotage?" I mean, look, you have conservative people in the labor movement, 100%. I mean, that's and going all the way back to the very beginning. I mean, this is one of the big fights, right? AFL-CIO. Um, there are more radical and more conservative elements of the labor movement. Gompers, right? Very famous name. Um, yeah, I mean, look, this is one of the things too that like I am a booster of working class politics and a booster of labor unions. I think that's pretty obvious. I think that that's where these things are going to have to come from. What we're going to have to work on building. But yeah, 100% you have to understand that like there is no like final victory, right? And there's nowhere where we're just going to be able to lie down in a bed of roses. There is always going to be a need for struggle, for more militancy, for more radicalism in these kinds of institutions, because yeah, you can have conservative leadership of labor unions. I mean, in fact, we're dealing with the crisis that has come out of that. And we'll play a clip in a second of Sean Fain talking about that kind of thing in just a moment, right? That's why, for example, like we go really hard on supporting campaigns like Sean Fain's campaign in the UAW, or groups like the Teamsters for Democratic Union, who are not only just fighting for the union movement as a whole, but also fighting to democratize those unions and put more power in the rank and file, right? Yeah, so these things are all terrains of struggle and competition. Um, Zodu says, "What are the structures and unions that prevent abuses of power that happen in companies?" Well, that's one of the advantages of a union is that you can file a grievance with the company, and that means that you're not just sitting there talking to maybe a biased HR agent, but you actually have the union behind you, and the union is prepared to use the tools at their disposal, um, either in the legal realm or even potentially go on strike if people are being individuals are being abused at work, right? So that's one of the advantages of being in a union is that you have the ability, instead of having to fight for yourself and your own dignity and against abuse on at work, you actually have a union that will back you up and fight for you to get those grievances settled. Let's play a couple clips and I'll get to some more questions. I'm probably going to have to leave in about 20 minutes. But I always enjoy these a lot. Just so we can stay on topic here, and then I want to talk a little bit about something on the international angle with this strike. I wanted to play a couple minutes from the segment from Status Quo, which is an organization that does tremendous and incredible work. And Jordan interviewed Sean Fain recently, and it's worth watching the whole interview. But just going back to what I was talking about the different tendencies even within the labor movement, right? This is why what's happening right now in the UAW and what's happening right now with Sean Fain and his slate is so exciting within the UAW.
I was here in 2019 during the GM strike, and you hear from a lot of old retirees that they constantly were told by UAW bosses, live to fight another day. Oh, yeah. We got to take this or they're going to close down the plant. I noticed you said something at the big rally the other day.
We have nothing to fear. The only limit we have is the limit we put on ourselves. We've got to stop it. No limits.
That seems bigger than just this strike. That seems kind of, you're talking about the working class, which has been battered and bruised, that we need to stop just being complacent with crumbs. Can you kind of talk about what you mean by, the only limit is what we put on ourselves?
When I hear the phrase, live to fight another day, I want to literally beat the shit out of somebody. We had that embedded in our brains as workers coming through over the years. And it would drive me up a wall when I would hear a leader say, live to fight another day. Another day came and went over and over, and no one fought. And so this is our time. We call this our generation defining moment. This is it. And so, and when I talk about not having limits, throughout my campaign running for this job, and even since then, when we're talking about our issues, when we put our demands out there, I can't tell you how many people would say, oh, you'll never get cost of living back. That's a thing of the past. Why are you fighting for pensions? We'll never see a pension. And all I heard is what we can't do. And unfortunately, that was driven by a leadership that had a can't-do mentality, settling for the bare minimum and making people think that's okay. The sky has to be the limit. We cannot limit ourselves on what we can achieve. If the founders of this union would have went into negotiations saying what they can't do, if they would have went in and they would have fought, or they wouldn't, they fought. They fought, they got beat up. Some gave their lives to have this opportunity, and they didn't give a damn what anybody told them they couldn't have. They said, no, we're going to take it. We're going to get what we have to get, no matter how, by any means necessary. And that's the mentality we have to have. We cannot limit ourselves by saying, well, I know cola's it's been gone for 14 years. It's a thing of the past. No, it's not.
And I mean, that's exactly it, right? Is that what's happening right now? Let's be really clear, because big fan over here, really big fan of Sean Fain and this entire leadership slate and what they're doing, right? But let's also not create cults of personality on this. This comes because rank and file people decided this is the leadership that they want, right? This is an expression of the willingness of the membership of the UAW to do something different than what they have been doing in the past, right? So again, even going back to what I was saying earlier about politicians, the same thing here too, right? Is that at the end of the day, what is going to matter is going to be what the rank and file decides to do. Because at the end of the day, those are the people who are going to be voting to accept a contract or not, right? So those are the people who are going to be making the final decision here, right? And what we're seeing within the UAW is more willingness to fight, more recognition of the importance of this kind of class struggle mentality. And Sean Fain is doing a great job at stoking that and leading that. But it comes deep, deep, deep within the rank and file here. And I think it's really important to not overshadow that. But yeah, going back to what I was saying earlier, it's like, all of these institutions can go a certain way. And it's just like anything in the entire world, the entire history of the planet, right? You can have an institution or an organization that has the right people, right? But we can make bad decisions. We can be weakened. We can be beaten. All of those kind of things can happen. And that's why, you can never just sort of sit on your hands and think that things are done. And that's why what's happening within the UAW should be praised, because it's showing a tremendous amount of courage, a tremendous amount of foresightedness, and a recognition that nothing is going to get better by waiting. Nothing is going to get better by kicking the can down the road for another day. Because as Fane just said, right, it's like we were told time and time again, live to fight another day. Well, another day has come and went, right? So that's something that I think is incredibly exciting there. And as Candified mentions here, wasn't Sean Fain elected because they changed their voting rules to make them more democratic? Absolutely. And that's the big part of this fight is like fighting for more union democracy too in this country. Now, I want to just shout something out as well, and then maybe I can take a couple more questions before I have to run. But one of the things that has been, one of the big planks of this program, and it's a big plank of my life and Matt's life. I'm a poor kid from the South, and I recognized early on in my life that the only thing that is going to make this world a better place for myself and my family, but also for my neighbors and in the working class as a whole, is going to be solidarity, militancy, and a willingness to fight. Excuse me. But that fight doesn't stop at the border. The fact is one of the things that's so promising about working class politics is there are more of us than they are of them. And what I mean by that is there are more working people than there are the rich and the powerful and the capitalist class. And the fascinating and critical thing that people need to remember is that does not change once you cross any border. The fact is that globally, it is the working class that keeps not just our country running, but the planet running. And there is a group of people that is global and is international and is incredibly powerful in country to country. These people are called capitalists. These people are called bosses who exploit the vast majority of people all across the globe, who spend the vast majority of their life, working people spend the vast majority of their life working for somebody else's benefit. And one of the promises of socialist politics, of working class politics, is the ability to unite people in a country and in a region, but most importantly, globally. Because as we've seen, the capitalist class is very happy to be incredibly mobile, right? And if conditions start changing in one country, well, they just get up and go move operations to another one. So that's why this has to be international. And you see these little ghouls and nasty guys, gremlins like Jim Cramer, say things like he said on his program recently, the solution to this contract struggle between the big three auto companies and the UAW is Mexico, right? So take jobs away from working class people in this country and move them to Mexico where you can exploit people at a higher rate. Bad news for Cramer, bad news for the big three is that the labor movement is international. And in fact, the mobilization, the militancy, the courage of people in this country is happening all across the globe. In Mexico, you have seen a massive explosion in unionization, in labor militancy, in these fights. And that has resulted in rising standards of living for Mexican workers. And Mexican workers recognize that as well. This is something I'm borrowing from the good folks at Labor Notes, which is a publication you should 100% be supporting year round, but especially right now, of some of these workers and what their message is to the big three and people who are trying to maybe use that group of people to break labor in this country.
Ante el corporativo de la empresa multinacional General Motors en México, integrantes del Sindicato de Trabajadores de Goodyear, México, para manifestar nuestra solidaridad con la huelga que tienen los trabajadores automotrices en Estados Unidos. Estamos de acuerdo con la exigencia de que tengan un contrato colectivo justo. Cuando las multinacionales tienen ganancias multimillonarias, también tiene que haber fuertes contratos colectivos. Estamos de acuerdo con que se paguen mejores salarios y lo mismo debe suceder en todos los países en donde estas empresas tienen operaciones, como es el caso de México, aquí en nuestro país.
Vamos, compañeros, Nosotros estamos aquí en solidaridad con ustedes, estamos a favor de que exijan mejores condiciones de trabajo, no bajen la guardia y juntos logren buenos resultados.
Trabajadores unidos jamás serán vencidos. Trabajadores unidos jamás serán vencidos.
So there you go, right there. The fact is that the labor movement in Mexico is going through a renaissance, and people there are fighting at great personal cost and a great personal threat against dangerous factions and groups within Mexico and in international capital. And it's incredibly impressive to see the solidarity, and that's exactly what we're going to need to be able to build something different, and in fact to build a better world. So you love to see it. We'd love to see all of the solidarity. Need to continue supporting it, continue finding ways to support the UAW. We'll see what happens. It looks very likely that more plants and distribution centers are probably going to be shut down on Friday. The big three has been on a media spree recently, trying to put their narrative out to the public. And it's been very funny to see the kind of paper tiger that right-wing pro-labor populism has been. These guys can't sit out here and say anything supportive of the unions in their fight. They try to do cultural war stuff about gas versus electric cars. But it looks like things are going to be ramping up. And the good news is that the vast majority of the American people support the UAW, and our job as people who are partisans, who want to see more working class power, not less, is to not just be supporting this in our heart, but damn, that's important, but to be outwardly supporting that in public, be it social media, be it talking with people in your church, in your community, your neighbors, and most importantly, your coworkers. And using the UAW as a good example of what you can get if you fight and you're willing to take on these big forces that harm us all. Everybody, I'm going to run. I appreciate all of y'all so much. This Sunday, we're going to be back with a bonus episode, myself and Mr. Matt Leck. Really looking forward to that. That'll be up for patrons, patreon.com/leftreckoning. If you want to support the show, as always, feel free to reach out to us at leftreckoning@gmail.com. We love hearing from all of y'all. We'll be back on Tuesday with the main show. I'll be back next Thursday with the Griscom stream. Until then, everybody, take care, and I'll see you soon.